In that process, Avi, as you're shutting down, if you want to start sharing your screen, that's fine too.
Okay.
So welcome everyone to another Friends from the Field webinar. We're super excited that you're all logging on for tonight's presentation. I'm going to do a little introduction of our presenters in a moment, but I just want to let you know that we have a chat box in the corner, and if you'd like to let everyone know your name and where you're from, and maybe a little bit about why you're interested in this topic tonight. It's kind of fun to get a little side conversation going on. And Jake, I think, is just going to tell us a little bit about the tech side of things, and then I'll do a more official introduction.
Thanks, Lander. So I want to point out two very important features for everyone. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box, which if you feel so inclined, you can communicate to Lander, Avi, and Cathy and I throughout the presentation. We'll just let Cathy and Avi do their thing and go through the flow, but Lander and I, at the end of the presentation, will do our best to, in order, file back through and ask your questions for you. Or you can wait until the end and use the raise your hand feature and ask our wonderful presenters your question yourself. You will have the option of tuning in just via audio, or you can, if you feel so inclined to, you can turn on your video as well. And
Lander, can I interrupt?
Yes, please do.
I can't, you've disabled my screen sharing. Can you turn that on?
Oh, absolutely. I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay. Sorry.
No problem. Okay, I think you should be set.
Okay.
And Lander, welcome back. It was so wonderful to meet your amazing intern last week, but we're so happy to have you back. And I'm going to hand it back over to you to do our formal introduction to our wonderful presenters.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jake. It's good to be back. I know Miranda had a good time hanging out with all of you last week as well. So I'm super excited to introduce Cathy, Rees, and Avi Clare. They are co-founders of the Native Gardens of Blue Hill, which I also wanted to congratulate you both. I know that you have just become a nonprofit, which is super exciting. So congratulations on that huge accomplishment. And I just wanted to say that Cathy has a little bit of background in ecology, and Avi has background in art, and they both have background in gardening. So it's a super cool combination of skills and expertise. So thank you both so much for being here with us tonight, and you can take it away.
Okay, I'm going. Sorry, I have to go back. Sorry.
No worries, take your time.
Excuse. Okay, here we are. Sorry. Okay.
Avi, you have a logo showing instead of you now.
I know. I was trying to fix it, but I don't know how to do it. So sorry, guys.
Okay.
All right. Well, we'll get going. All right. So, yep, this is what we're planning on covering today, and we hope to answer the question of why and how you could use native plants in your home landscape by telling the story of the Native Gardens of Blue Hill and why we felt we needed to create the garden and what we hope to accomplish with the garden and some of the challenges we faced and some of the things we learned, all of which we hope can help you take some steps toward sort of going native in your own garden. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so how did the native plant movement start? Well, it basically started in the Midwest with prairie restoration. So the result of that has been that a lot of times when you hear the words native plant or native wildflower, they're really referring to species that live on the prairies. It turns out that those species are great for the garden because they live in the sun and they're really showy, and so they're great for gardens. However, in Maine and the Northeast, we don't have prairies as a natural part of our ecosystem, so it doesn't really apply to us when you're thinking about what is native. So at the Native Gardens of Blue Hill, our definition is native to Maine. Just we had to define it somehow, and that just seemed like a good way to define it. So a lot of times when you see wildflower mixes, like seed mixes and things like that, it's mostly these prairie species. And in some of the worst cases, they're species that aren't even native to our continent. Anyway, in addition to that, there's a lot of confusion about what has been done by plant breeders to our native plants. So by messing with the genes, by selectively breeding and then vegetatively propagating plants, we've got plants that were native that now have a different color flower or a different shaped flower or other very different characteristics, like they're really short or they're really bushy. So all of this intervention has changed that plant's relationship with the insects and the fauna that normally interact with the plants. So in some cases it hasn't changed, but in other cases, like especially in the case of like sterile plants, there aren't even any seeds for birds to eat. So it's not fulfilling its role in the ecosystem like the native plant would be. So we like to talk about open pollinated plants, which are just naturally full of genetic variation, and that genetic variation is really important. But it's really the thing that helps plants adapt and cope with their own environment and the changes that might happen in their environment. Okay, next. So the next couple of slides are going to be kind of depressing. So bear with me for a little while. It'll get better. So humans have really altered at least 50% of the Earth's surface. That is like for housing and for agriculture and transportation and power transmission, all of those things. And so we really need to start thinking about those little fragmented parts of the unaltered landscape and what we can do to make those better habitat for plants and animals, the whole rest of the Earth's biota, really. And in addition to that, with various kinds of air and water pollution and changing climate patterns, I think we can really all say that maybe we haven't altered, but we've affected 100% of the Earth's surface. So what can we do? That's one of the things that started us down this road. Okay, next slide, please. So since the 1990s, there's been increasing use of a pesticide known as a neonicotinoid. And these are systemic pesticides that are used on a lot of major crops like corn, soybeans, cotton, canola, wheat, and even on things like sunflowers. And because they're systemic, even though just the seed was treated, this chemical is found in all parts of the plant. And that's basically how it works, so that it will deter insects from, say, eating the leaves or the seeds. And it inadvertently has affected the pollinators who are coming to those plants for nectar. So we were kind of shocked to learn that a lot of nursery plants, although not labeled, may have been treated at some point in their life with a neonicotinoid pesticide. And because of the way plants are propagated, a single plant might go through several nurseries before it gets to a retail nursery where you can buy the plant. This is, unless you've collected seed from a wild population and propagated it yourself, it's really the only way to know that your plant has not been treated. So this is another reason why we really believe that native plants need to be more local. Okay, next slide, please. So, so why are natives so great? It's really just because they have evolved with all of the other organisms in the environment, and because they have that genetic variability that I mentioned earlier that helps them cope with feeding insects as well as changing climate. So some of the, we're just showing some more charismatic species here. The caterpillar for the American painted lady is shown on the upper left, which his host plant, one of its host plants is the pussy toes. In this case, it's the plantain leaf pussy toes. And to the right of that is the, sorry, I'm just blanking here for a second, the Abbott sphinx moth caterpillar, which is like a super cool caterpillar that is found on grapes and Virginia creeper. And so, and then the Luna moth there in the lower left, that has its host plant is the paper birch. So that's where its caterpillars grow up and before they turn into this beautiful Luna moth that we saw at the native garden just a few weeks ago. And so this cedar waxwing here is eating elderberries. However, when it is nesting, it is looking for more high protein foods like the insects you see in the other photos. So these critters are just very important. They're just eating the plants and providing that nutrition to the birds. And these caterpillars are very protein rich and they're exactly what the little nestlings need. So many birds are going after insects early in the season. If there are no insects, there are not going to be any birds. And so on the right, we have a couple of plants that feed the mammals in our lives as well as our loved ones. So in the upper right are the beaked hazelnut and the lower right is the serviceberry. So both of these are food for us and a lot of different animals and birds as well. Okay, next slide, please. So since native plants are adapted to our climate and our soils, they don't take a lot of inputs in order to survive. So, or even we might want to add a little water to help them get established, but once they're established, they shouldn't really require that. So I was shocked to learn that nearly 9 billion gallons of water a day are used in the United States to irrigate lawns and ornamental plantings. And I really searched hard for more recent statistics, but I had to use these statistics from 1996, which say that over 2,650,000 tons of fertilizer was used on non-agricultural land in 1996 in the United States. And in Maine, there were 13,500 tons used. I can't even comprehend how much fertilizer that is. Anyway, it's a lot. So our gardens, in whatever shape or form they're taking, are definitely using a lot of resources. Okay, next slide, please. So I've been talking about how native plants are really well adapted, but when I heard this news in 2014, I was really kind of bowled over. So some researchers found some fossils that were virtually identical to our modern day royal fern. That means that that plant was basically living just like it does here in our yards and wetlands and wherever at the time of the dinosaurs. And it survived the extinction of the dinosaurs, and it survived the extinction of the great mammals, the ground sloths and saber-toothed tigers. Well, I mean, that just tells you how resilient that plant is. So we have to admire that. And so if we're thinking about, well, what plants are going to be most able to cope with changing climate, well, I think it has to be some of our natives. Okay, next slide. So with all of this in mind, the idea of the native garden was born in 2015. So our co-conspirator, Pam Johnson, who was also a longtime board member of Blue Hill Heritage Trust, I think she's the one who came up with the idea on a way home from a visit to the coastal Maine Botanic Garden. I remember her saying how she was disappointed that the native flora of Maine was such a minor component in that garden. And she dreamed of a place where people could see the beauty of our own native plants and what they could do for their own gardens. And I also remember her looking at the irrigation systems that were set up at the botanical garden and being a little flustered that they were trying to grow plants in places that they really shouldn't be, and that they needed all this irrigation to keep them alive. Okay, so next slide, please. So in our early discussions about the goals for the garden, we came up with a number of things we wanted the garden to be. So one, we wanted the garden to help out with other Peninsula efforts. So seed saving, pollinator protection, and healthy outdoor activities were a couple of them. So the seed saving is easy by welcoming people into the garden to collect seed. And the pollinator protection is just what you're doing when you're growing native plants. And habitat restoration was another. And then we decided to have some paths that people could walk through the garden and get a little bit of a little exercise while they're admiring the plants. Okay, next slide. So we wanted the garden to also become a place where people could learn about native plants and sustainable gardening. So after a seed sowing workshop, we gathered a group of people together to transplant the little tiny seedlings from one large pot into individual pots. So there's AV on the left-hand side helping. I think this is our youngest participant in any workshop right here. He's helping her transplant some little tiny seedlings. And on the right, this was the 2016 senior class from GSA who approached us because they wanted to build a native garden to give as their class gift. So we advised, but they basically designed and planted the garden themselves. So we were on our way toward educating future gardeners of the peninsula. And at the moment, we're currently working on a program to help people interested in getting trained for a career in landscape gardening to kind of fill the growing need for landscape professionals right here on our peninsula, and making sure that they are educated about sustainable principles and respecting the landscape while they're at it. So next slide. So we're also hoping that the garden can become a resource for schools to take advantage of. And we're also hoping it demonstrates good horticultural design on South Street as it develops, and we're also trying to encourage other groups to build native gardens around the peninsula. So on the lower right-hand corner, that's the GSA garden just recently. So it went from tiny little pots of plants 4 years ago to this, which actually could use some pruning right now. So with basically nobody taking care of it, occasionally, actually for the first 2 years, I think we had a group of kids work on some maintenance of it and put some mulch down and things like that. But now it's pretty much on its own, and you can see that it's really thriving. Okay, and next slide. So lastly, we had the very modest goal of changing the nursery industry. So we're both hoping to increase the supply and demand for locally grown native plants, kind of in the way that the local food movement began and grew. And we decided to start this by hosting an annual plant sale. It's usually on the weekend after Memorial Day, and which features local growers of native plants. And we're trying to encourage and assist local growers in any way that we can, so that we can have more plants available. And we were encouraged to hear from Rebel Hill Farm, who have been in this business for quite a long time, that the people shopping at our plant sale were actually the most informed, and that they were choosing the plants that were typically unappreciated by other buyers. So we felt like we were having at least a small effect on both the supply and the demand. Okay, I think Avi's gonna take it over from here and talking about things going on at the native garden.
And first, I just want to apologize that for some reason the logo is on the screen rather than my face, but I hope I just can't solve that technical problem right now. So I'm going to just go ahead. First, I want to give you a quick overview of the garden. We immediately saw the potential for demonstrating the advantages of using native plants on our first visit to the site. After Bagadies Music gave us a call and said, hey, would you like to come use our property for the native garden? So we went to visit and felt that this was a really good site. It's 4 acres. The overstory trees on the site are primarily oak, which delighted us, since oaks are host to 534 Lepidoptera, as a recent talk by Doug Tallamy seemed to incentivize that information for us. The amount of woods on the site was also a plus. We knew we could spend time editing the woods and introducing many shade-loving plants. There's a pond in the backwoods. Even though it's man-made, it had been there long enough to establish a fair amount of wetland plants and frogs and ducks. And then there were the challenges to the site. The summer house was conceived out of a design need. We had to create a focal point when entering this vast desert-like space of the parking lot in the back. That space had been carved out of the woods for the many cars expected to fill up during Bagadies Music events. It's a hot, dry, open area, and a pavilion to use as shelter from rain or sun was sited there. It has a patio garden next to it, which can demonstrate the many plants typically found in open ledges. And this is also the spot for entering the trail to the pond, as well as linking to other legs of our trail system. That bridge in the photo was recently made through funds granted from the Maine Community Foundation, and that's an ADA compliant bridge that leads to the ADA portion of our trail. The site for the new library is a particular challenge because the building is so high on a steep slope, and we needed to change manage the runoff from a large roof that doesn't have any gutters. It's the only place of construction where new soils were going to go in, and managing such a blank space is also a challenge since we have the goal of demonstrating gardening for a typical homeowner's budget. The performance hall was our main area to landscape since it was complete and not scheduled to have any other construction around it. So we added some small trees and shrubs in the front where there were none, and we tidied up the adjacent woods and planted some ground covers and perennials. The open space in the front of the property had a circular gravel driveway from its previous tenant when it was the Liberty School, and the soils there were actually several inches of gravel. You saw Cathy doing core samples in the previous slide. We knew we could demonstrate a lot of soil building methods, and with our mission to educate and demonstrate sustainable gardening, we designated this area to become the teaching garden. When thinking about choosing plants, we just first want to look at the conditions in nature and observe them there. Things to consider are our soil. Is it sandy? Is it clay-like? Is it humusy? The light. Most of Maine is a forest, and many natives live in various conditions of deep or dappled shade. Areas that are typically sunny are those open wetlands and shorelines and mountaintops or coastal ledges. The moisture. Some plants thrive in standing water where others require sharp drainage. But we also know that plants are adaptable, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Basically, think about the conditions where you see plants in nature. Consider the size or the scale of the plant. Is it narrow, wide? Does it have like an umbrella-like structure that other plants can live around? Watch for seasonal interest. Most of my time during this time of year is driving around thinking about what I see along the roadsides, especially the bloom or fall color, but winter is also a really long season in Maine. So think about the deciduous plants that could have some interesting form or color as well. Consider how plants spread or reseed. Will the roots invade other plants? Will plants spread by seed and become a weed problem? Or would it be a delightful occurrence to have some of them popping up in other places on your landscape? Push the limits. Gardeners can change the rules of competition. For instance, many plants live in wetlands and don't require those conditions, but they are simply better adapted in those places. And maybe they can't compete in drier locations where there are other stronger plants adapted to those sites. Certain conditions will impact plant behavior. Soils and moisture could make plants stronger or weaker. Light can make plants fuller and have more blooms. Shade will provide a more open structure for a lot of plants. And prune and shape. I can't say enough about this. The garden is a living document, and it's always in flux. It's up to us to determine what we want to see, and as well as having the sense of collaboration with nature. Having some kind of personal relationship to your garden is also really important. I'm just going to show this slide of an example of an extreme one of pushing the limits. This is our native witch hazel, which prefers light shade and moist soils. My goal for a small tree in this hot, dry spot with a carpet of bearberry, a plant that actually prefers dry sun and hot, dry conditions, is the most unlikely place for a witch hazel. But I knew I wanted that form and up against, to sit up against that concrete wall in a courtyard. So I was taking a chance, but I planted a very small tree to give it an opportunity to adapt to the site. And this picture was taken 7 years after the tree was planted, which was about 5 years ago. So it's a little bit bigger now, but I spend a time each year pruning that shape because in the sun, it wants to be quite full. And I wanted to have that shape of a witch hazel in a shadier situation. So this is an opportunity to just say we can experiment and we can push the limits sometimes and hopefully have some success. At the native garden, I'm just going to give you kind of an overview of how some things, plants can be used in a garden-like situation. For instance, a tree to be a single specimen. One of the, we would really like to sing the praises of the speckled alder, and we made a decision to plant it in a prominent spot at the native garden, and this is the top of the library slope. The amount of water coming from the roof and managing that water also created a little bit of a challenge. So we shaped the ground in this spot to be a little bit like a shallow bowl where some of the water could collect before it would run down the slope in a managed way. So we planted this alder and some bayberry to survive those conditions. We also have to think about winter frost, winter ground being frozen and standing water or ice in certain times of the year, and these plants can handle it. So we knew that this was a chance to show people that if you prune a tree that is typically considered a weed or something to get rid of in your landscape, you can have a beautiful presence, a beautiful presence of a tree in your. And we also wanted to, well, actually, you can read the tribute to a speckled alder if you have the second volume of the Wild Seed Journal, where Pam Johnson wrote a beautiful story about the woodcock and the alder. You can place a plant in a garden to have that has a strong color to act as a focal point. Here's the native Matteuccia on the left in yellow. It's in bloom right now, and in the early spring, it's always nice to see the blooms of a rhodora, so that can be a focal point, a strong spot of color in your garden landscape. You can use plants to screen or create a border. On the left, you'll see a picture of the performance hall when we first arrived to the site and how it looked in the blank space that was there. We immediately had an urge to plant trees and shrubs in this space in front of it to provide shade for the building and to also separate it from that large hot parking lot. We planted it with white birch, bayberry, and huckleberry. And the picture on the right shows what it looks like today. And I'll admit it could use a little bit of pruning. But the birch trees, as they will grow, they'll get taller and the stems of those trees will be more visible. And we hope that those white stems against the red foliage, fall foliage of the huckleberry will be a striking combination. And the bayberry also provides a lot of shelter for bird life while providing waxy berries, which are an important food source in the dead of winter. Using natives as in the transition spaces, we're often faced with a landscape between the more managed gardens around a house and the wilderness beyond. And there are many ways to address this transitional space. The parking lot at the Bagadies Music, as I said before, was carved out of a fairly dense woods, and there was a very abrupt line of woods against the open space of the lot. So we addressed this first by editing the woods. That's the bottom left photo, editing those woods to bring in more light into what was quite a dark, dense space, knowing that that light would encourage understory plants to emerge out of the seed bank that's in that soil. And we also knew we could introduce plants as well. But on a photo above it, that's us planting some shrubs that will also act as a gentle filter into that space. So it kind of helps to transition into those woods beyond and give more perspectives. So we planted in that space some shad bush, hazelnuts, the low bush honeysuckle, and also some witch hazel in those areas. The picture to the right, the lower picture, shows that where we're cleaning up and tidying up the woodland hollow near the performance hall to give room to introduce some flowering plants. So like in a home garden, these flowering plants could have a pretty clear relationship to the more managed gardens around the house. So again, another way to have some kind of transition. In this slide, it's just another example of using native shrubs right up against a very formal hardscaped courtyard. These are pretty high ornamental shrubs, and they give a foreground to the backdrop of the woods behind it. The summer blooming azalea on the left just finished blooming probably a week ago. And the clethra on the right will start blooming in a couple of weeks. Both of these are highly fragrant and wonderful pollinator plants. This lindera, the northern spice bush in the top, is an understory tree that blooms in very early spring before its leaves emerge. And it's under the canopy of a red maple in this photo. Here's a photo of our soil building efforts in the teaching garden. We saw an opportunity to make what some people call hugel piles. I think that's what we're calling them habitat berms. And they consist of straw, leaves, twigs, coffee grounds, wood chips, seaweed, things that we can find all around in our area. And we kind of change the ratio of what's in those piles depending on what we think we're going to be planting in them, like if we're going to plant shrubs, or maybe we're going to plant something herbaceous. Remember, this is the area that has all that gravelly soil. So the lower left photo is showing sweet fern in the foreground, and that's a really good soil building plant. It can grow in very gravelly soils. It fixes nitrogen, and it also has a lot of leaf litter, which helps build soils. And behind that, kind of behind the rock, and you can see that sort of orangey leafy thing, that's the bush honeysuckle. And that is also easily grown in gravelly soils, and it's also quite adaptable to roadside ditches, since the road salts in the winters don't seem to bother it. So the other thing we've been faced with at the native garden are the invasive plants, some of the invasive plants typical in our area. We don't have a lot of invasives on the site, and so we were pretty happy about that, but there is bittersweet and a little bit of knotweed in the front and some barberry. So you can see on the left photos that very small seedlings on the top bittersweet and below of the barberry. It's really a great idea to start to learn how to recognize those the plants when they're so small, because that's a great time to get rid of them. And you can see one of our volunteers in the center pulling some large, but also finding those small seedling plants that are easy to grab and get rid of. In the fall, I think it's sometime in late September, they start to turn that very distinct yellow color. So that's a really good time to look in your landscape to see if bittersweet is growing up your trees, because it might be hidden in the summer. You might not notice it, but you can really just see it quite well in the fall, as well as along all the roadsides in this area. So it's become quite an invasive problem. The top right photo shows someone using a piece of equipment called a weed wrench. It's kind of like a large, it has, let's see, like a vice grip at the bottom that's balanced by a bar kind of holding it to the ground. It acts like a fulcrum, and the vice grip grabs around a tree. You can see that tree in the parallel to the red stem of the weed wrench. And you can pull quite a good sized tree out of the wood, out of the soil. So that's something you can use for the tenacious invasives like bittersweet, although I will warn you, you will not get rid of all those roots, and you just have to keep coming back year after year and visiting the site and pulling more and more, and eventually you'll get rid of them. That blue tarp below, and that photo below, is just what we've been doing at the Native Garden. We didn't have the resources of trucks and getting things taken to the dump or burning piles in that site. So we're just covering the bittersweet as we cut it down, and covering it so that we know hopefully the berries wouldn't ripen and the birds wouldn't be attracted to it, and it would kind of decompose in place. But also, if things did reseed there, we would know where it is, because that's the place where those berries might have ripened and dropped, so we can monitor that place. The last piece I want to show here about the garden is looking for the right place for the right plant. And that corner of the library building we knew was going to be the hottest, driest, poorest soil kind of site. There was a lot of construction sand around the building. Again, we're working on a budget. We didn't have the resources to dig, and not only have, but didn't want to be digging out all the sand and replacing it with soil from some other place. We did bring in a small amount of soil, but we were trying to figure out what's the plant that could live in those conditions. Hot and dry, like a lot of the plants up there, but also the side of that library was going to reflect a lot of heat. So we really needed to find just the right plant. And we came up with beach plum. In fact, I know it was Pam that suggested it after days of pondering what should be there, what should be there. And I want to just report that it was a good choice, because those beach plum are happy, happy, happy. We don't have to water them. We watered them initially when we planted them. They're full of plums right now. They'll be ripening soon. So we're just another example of the right plant in the right place. And now we're going to move into some specific species.
Yes,
Cathy?
we'll just do like a little tag team here and just talk a little bit about some of the plants that we used. So for some trees that we planted the cherry birch or black birch at the service entrance to the library. Just because we had gray birch, paper birch, yellow birch already on site, we're like, well, we should have all the birches in Maine there. So we decided to plant that one. And then we planted gray birch on the opposite side of the library, because the way the leaves move in the wind, it is a sort of a musical kind of tree. And it doesn't seem to have the borer problems that paper birch has. And we transplanted all of these from a volunteer's house who said, I'm going to be putting a vegetable garden here. Do you want to take these 3-foot trees out? And we said, sure. So that's their new home right there.
Okay, this is the witch hazel. We talked about it before, or I talked about it before, but here it is in a site that is more appropriate to it and its form. You can see the beauty of it. This tree actually is in my backyard. I've never pruned it. So this is how it naturally grows, and that's of course the fall bloom.
Okay, so the next is the maple leaf viburnum. So we planted this by the performance hall. It doesn't seem to have some of the other viburnum leaf beetle issues that other viburnums have. It's just a lovely shrub with this flower that's, I think that's finished blooming now. But then the lower left hand photo is showing it, the fruits developing, and they're going to turn like a purpley black color. And that's a really nice shrub for the landscape.
Okay, sweet gale is another shrub that is found in the nursery trade. It's not as common, but it's common relative the bayberry most of us know. And this can be this is found in some wetlands, and it has that lovely fragrance that the bayberry has, but the leaves are a different color. It's that wonderful kind of cool gray green, and it has a soft kind of feeling to it in a garden landscape. It can grow in a variety of soils, but it can also do quite well, especially in a roadside ditch, which is the thing we like to say to people. Everyone has a ditch and on their roadside, and a lot of great plants that can grow there. So, and also be found there if you want to transplant them into your garden.
So the next are the more of the bearberry. So on the left, that's one of its two native habitats where it's really growing on a ledge in a really hot, dry situation. And on the right, it's growing on the edge of the woods. The one thing that you do need to provide it with is very good drainage. So I think because it's on the slope, on the edge of the woods, it's doing fine there. Obviously on the rock, the drainage is pretty sharp.
Bunchberry is another ground cover, and it can live in a little bit of sun. It likes dappled light best. You'll get, depending on the light, you might get more or less blooms, and then of course after the blooms the berries come. And on the bottom left, that's the fall color of the foliage. So it's a great edge plant for a path or any on the edge of most anything. It could also just live with other plants popping out of it. Moss.
Okay, next. Are we on the next one?
Yes.
Yeah, so mosses, my internet's a little slow, so I apologize. Anyway, so mosses are a great ground cover, and they're easy to collect and replant where you would like to see them. There's a few rules you need to remember though. Try to observe what substrate they're growing on. Are they growing directly on the soil? Are they growing on a log? Are they growing on stone? And try to simulate that in the place that you're transplanting them to. So on the left, this was a wet area that always had black wet leaves in it. I guess technically that would be a little wetland and just a little pocket. And so we created this an actual drainage line with some rocks lining both sides, and then planted the whole thing with moss. So then on the right, this is the haircap moss. This is growing between the rocks, and that's pretty much where you find that in nature. So that one's growing on, they're both growing on soil, but on the left-hand side, they're growing on rock and on soil. So very easy to transplant, just mind where it came from.
Okay, so the next two slides, this is a show garden behavior and things. This slide shows 3 reseeding natives for the perennial garden. So this is, again, if you like gardens, if you want your garden to have reseeding plants and develop a lot of seedlings you can pass on to your friends, or have things popping up in various places and have nice surprises in your landscape, these are the plants to consider using. The verbena, the blue vervain, is on the left. Our native Monarda bee balm, or it's also known as wild bergamot, is in the middle photo, and that's a picture in front of the library garden where it's kind of at the base of a slope. It does like all these 3 plants like a little bit of extra moisture, so these are all in the lower part of the slope in the native garden. And then the blue lobelia, it blooms a little later than the red cardinal flower lobelia, but it's also a great plant that does reseed around quite a bit. And then
Then if you don't want a plant that's going to take over or seed around, the swamp milkweed is my choice plant, because it's such a great it's a host for the monarch butterfly, so the caterpillars do eat it, but it's also a great nectar plant for a lot of different insects. And unlike its name, it doesn't need to live in a swamp. It's one of those plants where it lives in perfectly fine garden soil, and it will stay in its place and not move around too much.
The maidenhair fern is one of the more beautiful ferns. It's because of its form, it's kind of spiraling, wonderful shapes, and it does like soil that's a little more lime, but it can survive most soils, so don't get too caught up in that. But just in case you have a place near the foundation of your concrete foundation of your house, that's a good spot for maidenhair fern. And it can take some light. It doesn't have to be in shade, but I wouldn't put it in a hot, dry spot.
Okay, and then the next fern is the ostrich fern or the fiddlehead fern. Here it's shown in a garden situation. This fern does move around a little bit through runners, but it's very easy to weed it out. Anyway, edible fiddleheads and a beautiful backdrop for other garden plants.
Okay, so we're getting near the end, and we want to talk a little bit about how to obtain some of these plants. First of all, just basically celebrate what you already have, and you can edit your landscape to highlight certain things, open up the light. Raking and grooming and sweeping up things, just tidying up in general, will make a garden shine. And you can transplant what you have or what you might find in other spots on friends' properties or in roadside ditches, as we said. Collect seeds or root sprouts. This is a very economical way of producing plants for your garden. And then we do have a few local nurseries that we have been working with, and some of which have come to our native plant sale. 5-star nursery here in Brooklyn, Maine. The Rebel Hill Farm is outside of Belfast, as well as Honey Petal Nursery, both, and Fernwood Nursery. Those, if you want to take a trip to Belfast and a little bit west of Belfast, I would highly recommend visiting any or all of those nurseries. Well, actually, you have to make an appointment with Honey Petal and Rebel Hill. Native haunts and blue aster native plants are a little bit further south and west of us, so but you can find them on the internet. And there are people that sell native sods. Just be thoughtful and make sure that they're sustainably harvested.
So we just wanted to finish with this slide of the Rockefeller Garden, which was designed by Beatrix Ferrand, landscape architect, I guess, and this was actually designed in the mid-1920s. And this is called the Spirit Walk, and the ground covers in this part of the garden are all native plants. So the idea of using native plants in a garden, a very formal garden, is not our idea. It's not a new idea. And we just wanted to give a shout out to Beatrix Ferrand. So that's all we have for you. And I guess we can look for questions.
Thank you both so much. That was super fascinating. That's wonderful. I think we have one question in the chat box, and I just want to encourage people to put some more questions if you have them in the chat box, or raise your little blue hand. I have a quick question, and then we can delve into other people's. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my internet connection seemed weird for a minute. When you are making those habitat berms, how long do you wait before you put plants in them?
It seems like about a year is a good amount of time. If you do it just right, you can sort of get away with 6 months. If you sort of build them in the fall and plant them in June, depending on what you're going to be planting in there and how well established it already is. If you're talking about wee little plants, you better wait a little bit longer. But if it's a woody shrub, you know, a little transplant, you can do that much sooner.
We should also just mention, and I forgot to show images of the nursery beds that we made. We made raised beds where we made that was in one of the first slides where you saw people putting it in a raised bed, leaves and straw. And we planted herbaceous plants directly into it the following spring. We did that in the fall. We did put a little loam topsoil or soil in it as a seeding kind of thing, like a culture. And then we put a lot of herbaceous native seedlings into that the next spring, and they thrived. And that was like a holding bed. So you can, you know, do that.
That's super cool. Thank you so much. I have one of those in my yard, so that's really good to know. Jake, do we have any questions in the chat box that you want to bring forth? And then we have one raised hand as well.
Great. Yeah, we have a couple questions. Diane was wondering if there's a good source for native sod, and is swamp dewberry an invasive?
I'll take the swamp dewberry question. It is a native, but like all our brambles, it can ramble. So it can kind of take over, but I find that it's a really nice ground cover in an area that I'm not really trying to be careful about other things growing there. Again, it's kind of like beside my driveway. It does great, and the dewberries are delicious. So, Avi, do you want to take the native sod question?
Well, there's only one person we know of who seems to be supplying a lot of the state. His name is Fred Woods, and again, just I think he's pretty careful about where he gets them. They're sites that are already going to be under construction. And so you can also buy them at nurseries. So he's a wholesaler, but he does supply some of the local nurseries. So if you want to go to Mainscape or Surrey Gardens, it's likely coming from him.
That's great. Thank you both so much. I missed one of the questions before, and then maybe Lander, we can do the raised hand after that. Yeah. George asked if beach plums are the same as rows of rugosa.
No.
No. Cool. So let's see, we have a raised hand here. I'm sorry, I'm probably going to mispronounce your name, Mark Gale Brown. So I'm going to unmute you. You can talk.
Oh, hi, Marshall. Yes.
Let's see. Marshall. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Marshall, I think if you unmute yourself, you should be able to talk. I see that you're unmuted. We can't actually hear you, though, if you're talking.
Maybe she can write it in a chat.
That's a good idea. If you want to stick your question in the chat box, we can ask it. For some reason, we can't hear you. So sorry about that. Okay, it looks like it came up in the chat box.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. See chat message. Okay, so in the mid-Atlantic, we tend to grow native perennials and grasses in lean soil. Rich composted soil inhibits their growth and encourages woody plant growth. Is this the case with Maine native plants too? Of course, there's different soil requirements for meadow and woodland plants. Can you share the slides with us after this session? So a couple questions there.
So I guess we could just say that, unamended soil is fine for most of our Maine native plants here as well. And we find that rich composted soil is actually good for weeds. And our woodland soils do tend to be the richer soils because the leaves have been composting there for many years. So woodland plants do appreciate a little bit of a richer soil situation than especially herbaceous plants rather than shrubs. And yes, we can have the slides available.
If you want to share the slides with me, I can put them in the follow-up email so participants can receive that.
Mhm.
Jake, do you want to read the next question?
I would be happy to. Carol asked, well, she made a statement that in her neighborhood, the ditches are constantly dredged.
Yeah.
And then, let's see. Oh, she made a little mistake here, but it says, what can I say to the road cleanup committee before the royal fern disappears?
I don't know if you're allowed to. I know with the electric company, you're allowed to say no pruning on your roadside, but I don't know about the DOT. And you might want to get that royal fern out of there and put it somewhere else.
Right.
Or the upper part of your ditch closer to your property, to your house might be less likely to get dredged, the one side of it. But I don't know what your situation is and where, yeah. I'm sorry, that sounds really disappointing.
Sounds like we gotta move that royal fern and get it somewhere that it'll thrive.
It's one thing, it can survive the extinction of the dinosaurs, but not the DOT. What does that say?
And just for one, yeah, that's true. Okay, is there another question?
Yeah, there's a couple more questions, so we'll just kind of go through them. I'm trying my very best to go in order, so anyone who's posting, if I'm missing yours or skipping it, feel free to post it once more so that we can get the question asked.
Beth is next, Jake.
Beth is next. Thank you, Lander. So this is a great question, and Beth is asking if there's any good books or websites that you would recommend for learning about Maine natives.
Oh, yeah. Go Botany, or sorry, do you want me to start? The Native Plant Trust in Massachusetts has a section on their website called Go Botany, and that's a good place to type in the name of a plant, or even they have a key section where you can key in certain characteristics and features and get and to describe what you're looking at, and can kind of narrow in and figure out what it is. They also show you what's native to all the states in the New England states, and even they break it down into counties, so you can see what's native to which counties in Maine as well. And Cathy, do you want to talk about books or something? Yeah.
Well, I just was going to say that you could go to the nativemainegardens.org, which is the Native Gardens of Blue Hill website, and there's a resources page which lists a lot of books, websites, podcasts, things like that you might want to, check out.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I tried to take down notes for those sites, and I can put them in the follow-up email as well. I think we have another question. It says, I see you are recording. Will this be shareable? Yes, it will be. We'll upload it to the Blue Hill Heritage Trust YouTube channel and then share it around. So you'll get a copy of it in your follow-up email as well. And then let's see. What's our next question? I'm also trying to go in order here. Well, we have a bunch of comments. And some people are saying, thank you so much, great presentation, but they have to head out.
Oh, I see how tall will a beech?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can it provide shade enough for a house? Probably not.
I would say
I
about
don't think it gets
15 feet probably would be the maximum under grid conditions.
Well, let's see. We're at 5:05. If anyone has any last questions, you can stick them in the chat box. And thank you both again for joining us this evening. I feel like I've learned so much. I love plants with all my heart, and I feel like I've learned a lot from you too. And I'm going to be sending you probably personal emails asking questions. You both know so much. But we really appreciate the time that you spent with us tonight.
Yeah, it was really nice. Thanks, Lander and Jake. It was really a pleasure to be able to do this.
Yes,
Thank you.
very
Thank
much.
you both so much for your time this afternoon. It was lovely, and I look forward to maybe connecting again in the future.
Yeah.
In real life.
Yay, that would be great.
Okay. All right.
Good night.
Good night.
I'm going to stop. Yeah.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Night, Lander.
Bye, Jake.